Welcome. My name is George Haraxon. I serve here at Reasons to Believe as the RTB Scholar and Apologetics Community Director. And I also get to serve as an adjunct professor of philosophy and ethics. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Miguel Endara, and we're going to ask the question and talk about the Christian sexual ethic, specifically Augustine's sexual ethic or his understanding of the Christian sexual ethic, and has science, specifically neurochemistry, confirmed or disconfirmed what Christians have thought down through the ages. So Miguel, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you just want to talk about very light and easy subjects, I
That's
see.
right.
So you've done a fair amount of work on St. Augustine, understanding his ethic and his understanding of the Christian ethic. Maybe the first thing you could do is just maybe describe what was his view of the Christian sexual ethic.
Yes. For Augustine, we have to understand, to use a current term, is very conservative in his theology. So yes, he's one of the ones that founded Christian theology. He put the ideas of the Bible together in such a way that it was coherent, that it made sense, and he especially did this regarding sexual morality. The sexual morality in the Bible is talked about in different places, but never in one place is it put together. Now, for Augustine, he advocates the sexual ethic most of us grew up with, that we are to express ourselves sexually only within the context of marriage, and marriage is between a man and a woman.
And so what you've been researching is this is sort of in the Judeo-Christian view, at least historically. It gets challenged in different times throughout the ages. Particularly in our day, it's challenged quite a bit. What have we been finding from neurochemistry, from science, that either confirms or disconfirms this view of the Christian sexual ethic?
I wrote an article for the Catholic Bioethics Quarterly. It was published earlier this year, 2021. And there I explain that science actually sustains what Augustine says. Science backs up what he says. How so? That's a big claim, isn't it? Mm-hmm. How does it do that? Well, according to neurochemists, whenever people engage in a sexual relationship, a number of hormones are released. Amongst these, the most relevant ones are oxytocin, mainly released in women, vasopressin, released in men more than in women, and dopamine. But there are many, many other hormones released, and especially vasopressin and oxytocin. These are known as hormones of attachment, hormones that promote pair bonding in monogamous they help create monogamous relationships in animals, but also in human beings. Most of the studies have been done in animals, but scientists are connecting these studies to what goes on in the brains of human beings as well.
So that uniting of the male and female in this case,
yes,
creates some sort of attachment. Now you can think of the science of it and those chemicals being released. Kind of, what do you mean by that attachment? Are these feelings that are coming in the person? How more would you describe that?
Now, vasopressin and oxytocin, they have to do not only with romantic love, but with other types of attachments, other types of social bonds. But in the context of sexual expression, they have to do with romantic bonding. They have to do with, feelings of attachments, feelings of trust. According to scientists, if we just hug somebody for 20, 30 seconds, the hormone in women, oxytocin, gets released, but it gets released in relatively small amounts when it comes to expressing ourselves sexually. It gets released in relatively great amounts. But these hormones make us trust the person with whom we're with, and so our physiology, the way God created us, helps us to bind with our spouse for a lifetime. It helps us have deep and abiding relationships with our spouse.
So with that, I'm thinking of an analogy. I could, if I'm doing woodworking or that, I might put together two pieces of wood with glue, and that glue binds them together. And the longer it dries and things like that, the harder it is to separate. Or if you do separate it, there's a deep severing. And it sounds like
that's right.
That's what we're finding in science, is that this bond is created, it gets deeper and deeper, and to separate those two, to have
yes.
the really, is this why the Apostle Paul talks about kind of the uniting of man and woman as a head and body, that it's a deep unity?
It's a deep unity. The problem is, as you allude to, George, when people engage in sexual affairs, sexual liaisons, that with people that they just meet once or twice, and they just go from affair to affair to affair, to continue to use your tape analogy. If we use tape once, it'll work well. If we use it another time, it'll work less well. If we continue to use it in that way, then the potency, the power of the tape diminishes. It won't. The tape won't work anymore. It won't work as well. So it is with oxytocin and vasopressin. If we use it in many casual affairs, then they will lose the power of binding to people. And the problem, when that happens, the problem is that other hormones, you could say, take over. So in this case, maybe you could say a hormone like dopamine, which makes us feel good, takes over. So the person who has many sexual liaisons will remember the pleasure that person received while expressing themselves sexually. And they'll seek after the pleasure and not so much the binding effect, not so much binding with the other person. And that creates another problem. People who have had many sexual liaisons, when they're ready to get married and settle down, find that it's very, very hard to do so. Their physiology actually works against them. They no longer have this capacity. So it's very tough. I'm not saying that it never happens, but it just works against them. Why? Because they have acted in a way that's contrary to the sexual ethic. It's contrary also to the way Augustine explains it. One of the main characteristics of the sexual relationships for Augustine is what he calls sacrament. The idea here is that God loves us in an everlasting manner. God's love for us never goes away. And so also the marriage bond should be one of permanence. And so there's an analogy there between the love between the spouses, which is a permanent love, and God's love, which is also permanent. And that's the analogy he draws for marriage.
So we're saying that there's already a purpose, an intention, a design in the marital relationship, and you want to be careful about going against that design because of the lack of attachment, the lack of bonding. But yet we're hearing that science seems to be confirming rather than disconfirming that built into even our neurochemistry, it's already pre-set up so that we would bond with the mate that we're designed to be a part of. Am I hearing that correct?
That is exactly right, George. We are created by God to enter into marital relationships. I realize not everybody, God doesn't call everybody to marry, but for those of us who are called to marriage, we are created to bind with one person and to continually deepen that bond. So that's what God created us for. If we go against it, we not only go against God, we go against ourselves. And that's what's so interesting about this. God's moral law is given to us for our benefit. It's given to us because God loves us, because of God's grace towards us. We go against it, we go against it at our own peril.
Miguel, I was thinking, I don't just teach philosophy, but I was a pastor for 20 years and had to do a lot of counseling, both premarital, marital, and even crisis and divorce, and care for people through those different stages. It can sound like that this research almost then that we're irrevocably damaged, but that's not really the case. You just don't leave it at the neurochemistry, but you also talk a little bit about the spiritual side. There's another part to this. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe God is in the business of restoring people. God is in the business of redeeming people. So through his love, by means of his grace, there is hope for those people who have not led sexual lives according to God's moral principles.